This is, as you know, a conversation about our new report, the Leadership Limbo, co-authored by Rick Hess, who is on his way and will be speaking to you in a minute, of the American Enterprise Institute, and Fordham's very own Kobe Loop, who is in the back of the room and deserves both Rick and Kobe a hand for doing very good work on this project. And we are deeply indebted to the National Council on Teacher Quality, Kate Walsh and especially Emily Cohen, for the database that made it possible to undertake this analysis. Database which in effect codes the collective bargaining agreements or equivalents in the 50 largest school systems in America. We have a terrific panel this afternoon to talk after comment after Rick finishes. And then we'll have, I think, ample time for discussion with all of you before the refreshments arrive in the neighborhood of 5:30. Everybody's biographed in the folder that you've got, so I'm not going to do elaborate introductions. But Terry Greer is the superintendent in Guilford County, North Carolina, which did exceptionally well on this rating of school system collective bargaining agreements. And he, being a glutton for punishment, will be leaving this summer to go to San Diego, California, which did not do as well on this rating of collective bargaining agreements. Gail Littlejohn was, until recently, the chairman of the school board in Dayton, Ohio, and is now the senior vice president, chief operating officer at Center for Reform of School Systems in Houston, Texas, Don McAdams' organization there, and we're delighted to have Gail at a Fordham, Washington event. She's been at Fordham, Ohio events in the past. Bill Robbie has a NEA title that is explained in the packet. We are delighted that he is here to talk with us about this report as well. We've got an incredibly to be precise, Director of Collective Bargaining and Member Advocacy at the NEA up the street. So he didn't have to travel very far, but we are very pleased that he's here to offer his perspective on Rick and Kobe's report. I will, let me also thank Mike Petrilli and Christina Henches of Fordham for overseeing and organizing the event, and Mike for organizing and overseeing the project as a whole. I'll just launch Rick with one, I thought, amusing anecdote from 2 days ago. I had spent the weekend with my 4-year-old granddaughter in New York, which is something I try to do once a month, and I was trying to explain to her that I had to come home early on Monday, President's Day, so that my wife and I could work on our tax returns, something that basically everybody does at some point in February or March. And I said, Emma, do you know what taxes are? And she said, no. And I said, well, taxes are money you have to give to the government so that it can pay school teachers and policemen and firemen and people who pick up the trash and who fix the roads. And she nodded, and I went home to Washington to work on our tax returns. And later that day, my daughter calls and says, Dad, you're not going to believe this. She said, Emma had a quarter this afternoon, and we said, don't you want to put it in your piggy bank, Emma? And Emma said, no, I need it to pay my taxes. I thought this was both a quick study for a 4-year-old and an early lesson in civic responsibility. Welcome again, and without further ado, Rick Hess, the lead author of this study, is going to give you a 10-minute overview of what he and Kobe found. Take it away, Rick.
Thank you, Checker. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and be brief. Do we have our hard copies here? Are they available online, or what's?
Hard copies are available online, and there is an order form in the folder, and the executive summary and forward are in the folder.
There you go. Basically, the full report is something resembling a book. For those of you interested in the national picture, it's the first 25 pages, 30 pages, which are actually the analysis. The rest of that book is the blow-by-blow reports on each of the nation's 50 largest districts. So there you All right. What I want to do is just walk you briefly through what we attempted to do, briefly what we found, and some of the key takeaways. Premise here is relatively straightforward. As we know, a lot of conversation around collective bargaining tends to take on hysterical tones. There are certainly those who have imputed evil or unsavory agendas to the NEA and AFT, and have suggested that they are engaged in something resembling a criminal enterprise against the nation's youth. And then there are certainly those on the NEA and AFT side of the ledger who have questions and motives, the decency, even the sanity of some of those who've raised questions about collective bargaining and about the role of unions. I'm not trying to, obfuscate it at all. I'm someone who's regarded as something of a skeptic about the role of unions and CBAs. Given that, our approach here, however, is to recognize that unions in any large-scale enterprise typically have a useful and appropriate role. However, the orientation from which Kobe and I came to this is that particularly in an area, in a sector is characterized by the need for nuance, for judgment calls, for flexibility at the teacher and school level, that the kinds of one-size-fits-all management, which can sometimes be imposed by union and collective bargaining agreements, is probably not ideal, and that therefore the hallmark of effective collective bargaining agreements for the 21st century is that they recognize the need in an era of accountability for school leaders and district leaders to have some discretion on making decisions that relate to provision of educational services. In particular, what we suggest is that this is true in three areas. One, that related to teacher compensation. Two, that related to personnel policy. And three, those related to work rules. Again, the argument is not that the existing contractual provisions, which in many cases have been handed down from the 1960s and 1970s, are nefarious or themselves necessarily wrong-headed. They may have made sense when they were first adopted. The point is that now that we are in an environment where we have metrics on performance, where we are holding school leaders and educators accountable, that the ways in which we want to organize educational environments in schools has probably changed. In order to see whether or not, and now obviously if somebody rejects that premise, the report, I'm trying to be quite transparent, flows from that premise. If you reject that premise, that's reasonable, in which case you might quibble, you will quibble with some of the findings. If one accepts that premise, that flexibility on these three dimensions is critical, we then proceeded to develop a report card which featured 4 grades in each category, constructed out of 26 indicators that were available in the NCTQ database. Those 26 indicators you'll find them explained and arrayed in the particular report. They deal with a variety of issues relating to how much flexibility districts have in compensating educators, how districts can approach decisions regarding transferring of teachers, regarding awarding of tenure, and evaluation of teachers, and work rule considerations that we'll point to in a couple different kinds. Obviously, when one looks at this kind of stuff, what do the collective bargaining agreements say on these counts? A couple of issues come to the fore. One, of course, and perhaps the most significant, is the degree to which state statute or state regulations render local collective bargaining agreements irrelevant because they take the bat out of the district's hands. To the extent that state statute or regulation dictates policy on any of these counts, it doesn't really matter what the collective bargaining agreement says, and therefore we would probably be wrong-headed to go coding it. The National School Board Association was particularly helpful in this count. We were able to contact the State Board Association in almost all of the states and solicit information from the NSBA as to whether or not state statute or regulation trumped district policy on these various counts. It did in every single case on that of teacher tenure. Outside of teacher tenure, it hardly ever did. A couple of caveats worth flagging. One, it's important to recognize that labor agreements are obviously only one piece of the puzzle, that when we're talking about governance and management and school quality, and whatever collective bargaining agreements say or do not say obviously needs to be understood a kind of part and parcel with grievance procedures, with state law, with the role of the courts, with political conversation, school board elections, and so forth. Second caveat is that for the 50 districts, because of the time scale and the amount of energy invested in trying to do this coding exercise at the NCTQ end and then at our end, we are not current in each of these contracts. 18 of the contracts have been renewed since the data was collected and entered in the NCTQ database. If you follow these agreements with any proximity, you know that they tend not to change radically one iteration to the next. So I'm not terribly concerned about what that means for the analytical results in the aggregate, but it does mean that what we report for a given district could certainly be out of sync, particularly on a given provision or two. Key findings from this thing. In the aggregate, what we did was we used a real simple scoring metric. If your contract gave management of the district explicit flexibility with regard to compensating educators, for instance, the ability to pay educators in high needs areas more, the ability to pay teachers with assigned to difficult to staff schools more, the ability to pay veteran educators transferring from out of state more. If that was explicitly recognized in the contract, they got an A. If the contract was silent or ambiguous on a particular capability, it got a C. If the contract was restrictive on this count, it got an F. Quite simple. Now, the one natural question that I wrestled with and that you might have is, well, geez, if a contract is silent on a point, why is that graded a C? Doesn't that suggest flexibility? It's a reasonable query. My response, and the reason we approached this the way we did, is that given the realities of district management, of past practices, understandings, and of the web of forces that act upon school districts, my impression is that that silence in a language should certainly not be a negative against a district, but silence in a language can mean many things and shouldn't clearly be understood as a hallmark of flexibility, hence the grading. When graded in that way, we find that 5 districts appear to come across as highly flexible. The top of the 5 is Guilford County. About 15 districts appear to be quite inflexible. The conventional concern about the fact that districts are restricting the ability of principals and superintendents to make good decisions. But perhaps most significant and most surprisingly, about 60% of districts are not clearly either flexible or inflexible. Instead, what we find is that the vast majority of districts are somewhere in the middle. And we want to talk about what that means in a second. You see right here the different districts arrayed. If we look at where the districts tended to do best, we flag 3 areas here. One is that about nearly half of districts explicitly had the authority to raise starting teacher salaries based on teachers' previous experience. In other words, to grant additional steps. About a quarter of districts on average had the ability to factor student performance into teacher evaluation. And districts were slightly more likely than not to have the ability to reward teachers who agreed to staff high-need schools. Where districts fared worst tended to be in the work rules component. The area where they tended to score worst, where they were most restrictive, is school districts were generally required by collective bargaining agreements and associated board policies to pay teachers to attend professional development activities outside of the scheduled workday. Now, obviously, and in fact, I should say that Bill, as well as a couple of colleagues at the AFT, were actually helpful in clarifying our thinking and in crafting this report. Obviously, in no way, shape, or form does that mean Bill actually is comfortable with particular findings or takeaways, but I do want to acknowledge that. And somebody like Bill will quite legitimately say, well, geez, how can it be restrictive? How can it be a problem that districts have to compensate teachers for professional development outside the workdays? What I would simply suggest is that in most professional fields, it is not a prerequisite for professional development to offer additional compensation or stipends to expect professionals to pursue professional work. We are in no way, shape, or form suggesting that it's a bad thing to pay staff for taking on necessary professional development. What we are suggesting is that you will find relatively few consulting firms, relatively few law firms, relatively few engineering firms, relatively few professional firms of any way, shape, or form, where in order to expect your employees to go pursue professional development, it is mandatory that you pay them an additional stipend. That is the degree to which these contracts can be inflexible. Most contracts tend to be quite inflexible when it comes to rewarding teachers of subjects which are in high demand. In other words, many contracts explicitly prohibit the ability of districts to offer additional compensation to teachers in math, sciences, English language learning, and so forth. And third, nearly half of contracts entail a requirement that schools provide faculty additional leave in order to attend to union activities. Now, again, this is not something you would be necessarily surprised to find in the 1957 Detroit auto workers contract, but I would suggest in a professional line of work where we think it matters a lot whether or not teachers are in the classroom with their kids, that writing mandatory collective bargaining language which stipulates that teachers be given additional leave to miss school time for union activities strikes me as antithetical to the ability of superintendents and principals to make effective educational decisions. One particular point, which I think comes out of this, which is quite interesting, is we have frequently gotten into conversations about the impact of right-to-work laws and how they have affected the quality of collective bargaining agreements. What our findings suggest is that this is right to an extent, that there is clearly a difference between the flexibility or inflexibility of agreements in states that mandate collective bargaining and those that do not. But what I would also suggest is that these disparities are not nearly as large as some of the more ardent proponents of right-to-work laws would suggest. And what it suggests is that even in states where districts are not required to negotiate formally with the local bargaining unit, that you nonetheless see contracts which entail a number of the similar ambiguities and flexibilities that you would see in other districts. Finally, a couple of recommendations. Let me just hit the key recommendations here. One, what's unusual about this exercise, I think, is just that it's unusual. This kind of exercise, looking at these contract provisions, debating what they actually say, explaining them from various valence points, seems obvious and useful and important, whether or not we necessarily agree about how to interpret the significance of any given finding or any given provision. This has not been done before in this fashion. Hopefully more of it will be done going forward. Second, I think what it clearly suggests is that districts, particularly the 15, where it looks to me like superintendents and principals are really operating with one hand tied behind their back, need to do a better job at the bargaining table of pushing for the kinds of contracts that will allow them to manage in a 21st century fashion. Third, that said, it's clearly the case in something like 2/3 of districts, principals and superintendents have much more maneuverability and much more agility than rumor sometimes suggests, that they have much more freedom to act on some of these counts than they sometimes tell reporters or chambers of commerce that they do, that this is largely a case of them choosing to interpret ambiguity as permission to move forward rather than as a reason not to take difficult measures. And therefore, I think there's a need for boards of education, for local reformers, for advocates to encourage superintendents and school boards and principals to act in ways that they sometimes don't. And finally, I think there's a need to push on the NEA and AFT locals to embrace the same kinds of reforms that we saw last fall in Detroit, for instance. These kinds of transitions are never pleasant and never easy, but there is an opportunity, is illustrated, say, by Green Dot Charter Schools and the thin contract that they've pioneered in L.A., to come to new agreements which are going to work in the interests of both educators and students going forward. And with that, let me open it up to the panel.
Very much, Rick. We are going to go in alphabetical order, which means Terry, and then Gail, and then Bill, and I've asked them to keep their opening comments to about 6 minutes each. And I'm going to try to keep time and be brutal if necessary in asking them to finish up so that we can have time for discussion. And you all may either sit where you are and use the mic there or stand up where I am if you would rather. Without further ado, thanks again, panel. Take it away, Terry.
Thank you. It's good to be here today. I've been in Guilford County as their school superintendent since 2000. And I know in talking with Checker and some others about why Guilford County scored so high on the flexibility index, I do think that has something to do with it. I think I think it takes time to develop trust. I think time to operate with a certain strategy of trying to purposefully think about how you can empower others and work with others to improvement. And I do think that is important. I also would say to you that I think that leadership matter. I think that the leadership Board of Education is a little closer. Thanks, Jacker. Is very important. I think sometimes when we criticize collective bargaining and teacher contracts, we forget that the school boards and superintendents also own those contracts and agreed to everything that's in there. And sometimes we're very direct in saying this is a union issue. The union may be focusing and pushing in a certain direction, but the contract doesn't belong to the union, it belongs to the organization because both sides have agreed to it. So it does take strong leadership on behalf of boards and on superintendents and, quite frankly, on behalf of union leaders. We have a different union president in our district today. He calls himself an association president because we are a right-to-work state. Now, if you think that he has no political power, and if you think he doesn't wield a lot of influence over our Board of Education and a lot of other things that happen politically in our community, then it was you that fell off the turnip truck in North Carolina and not me. He's a very dedicated educator, and he's a different kind of leader than organizational presidents that we have had in the past in that organization. He has no agenda. He's a very smart man. This past year, to show you the relationship that we've developed, the two of us co-chaired our United Way campaign in the district, and it was the most productive United Way campaign we'd ever had. And when I sent him a copy of this report, I got an email back from him that says, this is what can happen if you're willing to sometimes set aside differences and work together. And so I think that takes time. I don't think that just happens. And I do think sometimes there has to be the right chemistry and the right leadership on behalf of not just the superintendents and union leaders, but also boards of education. And there has to be a singular purpose. At the same time, if you're going to have the kind of flexibilities that we're talking about here, you also have to have, I think, a degree of responsibility that you're not going to mistreat people. And with that comes the trust, I believe, that yields you the kind of flexibility that you want. In our district last year, we had an extremely, well, not just last year, but for the last 7 or 8 years, we've had an impossible job of staffing some of our inner city schools. We've had middle schools that did not have a certified math teacher in that school all year. We had elementary schools with all 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers new to that building. We would have teacher fairs where in huge rooms you would have tables with principals and teachers trying to recruit new teachers. And in our affluent schools, you had lines as far as from here to the street. Across the room in our most impacted schools that had the highest concentration of poor non-white students, not one person at that school, not one. And I said to Mark, we've got to do, and I said to our board, we have to do something differently. And we implemented a program last year that we dubbed Mission Possible. And we pay math teachers to teach in our 6 most impacted high schools. They can earn $18,000 a year more than if you teach in a regular school. They get $11,000 more for teaching there every year. And if they get great value-added test results, they can earn an additional $4,000. We put Promethean whiteboards in all of their classrooms. We give all their kids handheld calculators. We have a 3-week summer institute that they go to, and if they do well, they earn an additional $4,000. And it was something that our teacher association didn't necessarily want to agree with. They may have agreed in principle, but they had a lot of teachers who didn't agree. And they said we shouldn't be differentiating salary. And I said in return, we've differentiated salary in this country for years. We've differentiated it based on experience and on degree. You can't find me many research studies that show you that someone with a master's degree produces better results than someone with a BS degree. And most of the research tells you that teachers from 12 to 24 years of experience is the age group that gets the most value out of a kid's educational career. So we've been differentiating salary in this country forever. So why could we not differentiate based on it being very difficult to find a teacher to teach in a hard area to to staff like math? You can graduate from math with a math degree from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro or North Carolina State. First year out of college, you make $48,000 to $50,000. My place, you make $32,000 as a teacher. I'll ask you, are we getting the top line mathematicians come into our school and teach? And this stuff that, well, people don't teach just for money, we need to get over that kind of rhetoric. Teachers deserve to make a lot more than they make. And if I could be king for the day, I'd double the salary of every teacher in our state, and I'd do it without any reservations. Our teachers all need to make more.
And we would accept
I'm sure you would. You probably wouldn't even have to have it negotiated to an agreement. But the point I'm trying to make is, it's to me, thinking that you're getting quality, the best quality math teachers when they can go to work right out of college making $18,000 more is ridiculous. And I can tell you, a year before we implemented this program, we had 7 high school math applicants on file in a district of 71,000. A year later, after we implemented this program, we had 179 applicants on file. You can't tell me it doesn't make a difference. We see it. We feel it. And what I would say to everyone, and what I say to our teacher organization, what I'd say to AFT and NEA, our poorest non-white children deserve the same quality education that our affluent children do in this country. And people can sit there and say, oh, well, there's nothing in our negotiations that prevent that from happening. Well, I can promise you, we offered our teachers, we offered to have job fairs, and we offered our experienced teachers, please come teach in these schools. Come help our poor kids. I had teachers when I went out and had focus groups and said, what would it take you to teach in our inner city schools? I had teachers say, you couldn't pay me enough.
Thank you very much, Terry. Gail Littlejohn, and we're learning about these mics. You have to bring it close to your mouth.
I'm going to create a place.
You want to do this? Fine.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
Getting used to bifocals. I can see better if I'm actually looking down on things. But anyway, it's good to be here with you all. I bring a little different perspective. I was president of the school board in Dayton, Ohio for 5 years, but I've also worked with the Center for Reform of School Systems off and on for the last 6 years, and then permanently about 6 months ago. We work with the 100 largest school districts across the country, so I have some perspective from them as well. And as I looked at this study, which I think was well done based on the material that was at hand, I guess my first caution is not to overgeneralize, because there are thousands of districts out there that have organized labor agreements that weren't considered in this study. And a couple of other points just about the study, that sometimes the ambiguity in the labor agreements is deliberate, and it's deliberate because that was the only way you could fashion a win-win between the parties. And so if you got too restrictive, or you were too deliberate in terms of your language, you never would have agreed. So sometimes it really is the right thing to do in order to settle the agreement. And then also, just not inherent in this study is the complexity of the relationships. It is not unusual for principals to tell you that they're actually in fear of having this power and control that should be inherent in their position. And I've talked to many principals, not just in Dayton, but across the other districts, and they'll tell you that as soon as they trigger some kind of a disciplinary action, they write up a teacher, then a whisper campaign starts about that principal. And their character is maligned, and the rest of the teachers are led to believe that this is a witch hunt for this poor teacher, and it spreads out to the parents, and the parents are talked to about this principal. And most principals who have gone to bat once on a disciplinary hearing will tell you that I'm not doing it again. Because it distracts the whole school because of one teacher because of one teacher and their disciplinary issues. So one of the things you can't teach somebody is courage necessarily, or the Constitution to be able to stand up against the hazing that they sometimes get when that disciplinary action goes into effect. There is a leadership limbo. As more parties join the fray, it is harder to hold anyone accountable. You know, you've got mayors and you've got legislators and everybody now that want to be a part of reforming schools. Historically, we've moved from local control, now we've got the state involved and the federal people involved, and it really does get confusing for those of us who are on school boards or even superintendents who have to sort of interpret all of this. School boards struggle learning how to govern. They just really do in all of this fray. They struggle learning how to govern, and that's one of the things we try to teach at the center. And then even the best superintendents, they have the agenda of the district at heart, but they also have their personal agenda. So my point is that these relationships, when you're trying to interpret and implement these labor agreements, really get complex. Principals are often given limited authority from central office. That has nothing to do with the labor agreement, but it's just the superintendent's style. They're just very controlling and all are willing to give up so much power. It is really an untenable position that we put these principals in, that they're supposed to be principal leaders, building leaders, instructional leaders, and we really give them so little support. The union presidents, on the other hand, they have a tough job too, because I have met some that feel like they have to talk the tough talk and walk the tough walk, regardless of how reform-minded they may be. The reality of it is that politicians, board members, union presidents, I mean, for the most part, we're all elected. And the fear factor is that we'll lose our jobs if we try to be too tough, and that's just the reality of it. Other comments, just in general, complexities within the roles and relationships. Boards and legislators have good reason not to take on the unions, as I said earlier. But on the other hand, legislators frequently borrow from other states, and they borrow without really necessarily understanding the impact on the local boards, on the implementation, because one great idea in Iowa may not be the same great idea in Texas. They don't just necessarily translate. The other issue is we don't really know what a win-win looks like, and that's troubling for me. We don't know what a win-win looks like for the teachers union and for local school districts. It would be great to sit down and have a really candid dialogue about that. We don't know, they want to be treated as professionals. We want them to be treated as professionals, but I think that definition of what a professional is really differs. Too many traditional adult issues are allowed to trump the needs of students. I see that all over the country. And I also see what I refer to as, several elephants in the room. There's seldom any real correlation between tenure and skills. I saw that in Dayton, Ohio. The more tenured teachers, the more senior teachers are not necessarily the best teachers. How do we get beyond that? Pay is an elephant in the room. We want school districts and teachers to borrow from corporate America, but we're not willing to step up to the plate and pay those teachers those corporate-like salaries. And then there's an ongoing conflict in many districts between the teachers and the administration. Anything the administration says do, they run in the opposite direction. There's just that conflict that I don't know if we'll ever resolve that. And then realities in the current environment. Salaries and benefits in most school districts are already 80 to 85% of their budget. And so where do you get the flexibility to reward these teachers, and even if you want to do some kind of paper for performance or give them a significant salary increase? And then you've got declining state budgets all across the country. I know we have that in Ohio, where you want more money, but the budget's shrinking. So where do you find the additional monies that you need? There's also a history of giving up management rights in lieu of salary increases. I saw that in Dayton, Ohio. You didn't have money to give them salary increases, and so what do? You give up your management rights, and we spent the 6 years of my presidency trying to get some of those management rights back. And I don't know where the public is on all this. I mean, they were just much too silent in Dayton, Ohio, and hope they stand up to the plate. So here are some recommendations for me. Boards must be stronger leaders. They must be more strategic. And so one of the first things you need to do as a board member is really understand that labor agreement. Where does it impact your reform agenda? Where is there ambiguity? Where are there opportunities to close that ambiguity? Where can you write board policies that will help reinforce certain things in that labor agreement? What coaching does the superintendent need to nudge him along and really empower his principals? Because sometimes that is the problem itself. And how do we rebalance so that it's not just about roles and responsibilities, which is a lot of what you see in the labor agreements, but it's also about accountability and empowerment? So specifically, what did I find in Dayton? I found contracts with a labor agreement with really old language, a lot of management rights we had given up, and I'll give you some quick examples. In terms of professional development, we had to renegotiate the superintendent's right to decide what kind of professional development a teacher would receive, because they used to be able to decide what they needed. We did have to start paying them for professional development on Saturdays. So they would not do it unless we paid them. Even though No Child Left Behind gave us a right to reconstitute schools, we had to actually negotiate memorandums of understanding in order to be able to reconstitute 4 schools in Dayton, Ohio. In terms of, we also started some specialty schools. We have an early college academy with students who are ready to drop out of high school in partnership with the University of Dayton. It takes a very unique teacher with patience and some unusual skills to do that. We also started single gender schools, one for boys and one for girls, and we had to negotiate memorandums of understanding in order to bypass those seniority rules to make those schools happen. And then we also had to negotiate for technology in the classrooms, whether it was for reviewing and learning how to analyze the student performance data, but the teachers were not readily receptive to the technology. So seniority is still an issue. It impacts reconstitution, it impacts what teachers go into what schools, and in many respects does negatively impact reform. It's time consuming. The conflict that goes on between districts and school boards and superintendents negatively impacts the image of public schools and certainly doesn't do a whole lot for the relationships. And I think you're trying to flag me down, so I'll stop. Thanks.
I'll sit. Okay. First of all, I'm glad to be here. Anytime I can talk about collective bargaining agreements, I'm really pleased to do that. Usually I get to do that only in front of people who are definitely going to agree with me, and I don't think that's the best way, actually, to have the discussion.
We promise that won't happen today.
And I don't think that's the best way to have the discussion. Let me just give you one quick learning. Often I hear people use right to work and non-bargaining as synonymous. They are not. There are many, well, there are some, not many, but let me give you Iowa and Nebraska, right to work states, but they have collective bargaining laws. So I think to all of us, we should be careful about using those terms interchangeably. That has nothing to do with the report, but whenever I hear our members say it, because they say it all the time, I try to inform them about that. So why am I here and why would I agree to do this? First of all, I think because I assume that all of us have good intentions. All of us have the intentions that we believe that every child, as the Superintendent Greer mentioned, every child should have a quality school. We shouldn't let any children go away from school not having been prepared for their future. We shouldn't consider any children throwaway children. There should be no children who come into schools that are falling apart or don't have the right kind of resources, including quality teachers and quality school personnel throughout the district. I'm also here because I believe that the typical way we do business, even around education, is not the way we should be doing business any longer. We shouldn't be talking about blame and division. We should be talking about how it is that we work together to move ourselves forward. And I'm here because I believe collective bargaining and the collective bargaining agreements have been really underutilized tools. And what do I mean by that? I think often they've been underutilized because school districts are nervous about expanding the scope of bargaining, or legislators are nervous about expanding the scope of bargaining. I think sometimes it's underutilized because we as unions have failed to realize the possibilities that there are to really take a look and use what we have as a tool to impact school culture, to impact things like professional development, to impact student achievement, and to really impact career paths. I think one of the things that's clear for us, we have to continue to think about how do we create career paths for teachers to stay in the classroom, or at least to stay in the system whereby they can help others move forward in their education. And I'm here because I believe unions have a real role to play in all of this, and that we have to be part of examining what our role is as well. I'm not going to do a complete analysis of the report. I've read it, I've written it on it, I've sworn at it, and I actually said amen to it in a couple of places. So I think that at least it creates that kind of discussion. When it comes to the report, there's such a focus on principles. I think sometimes we fail to focus on some other things, and I'll talk about that. Not only are principals accountable, but teachers are accountable every day for the achievement of students, and we should embrace that accountability. We should be looking forward to being accountable. I can also tell you when it comes to one of the things that I think the report misses is that unions across this country for years have been trying to engage in the discussion of using collective bargaining as a more effective tool, and often they've been rebuffed by, again, people who've been they've been afraid to engage in that kind of discussion. So I think we have to consider that. And I heard the discussion about ambiguity and management rights. I can tell you that I come from the perspective that really all of the rights are management's, and then the union engages in those rights and helps to guide some of those rights and helps to share some of those rights through the collective bargaining agreement. So if something isn't mentioned, to automatically score it lower, I think really gives low scores. I think it gives irrelevant results to what you've been trying to look at here. The other thing that the report does and NCTQ talks about is the fact that now these documents are in the public domain. They've always been in the public domain. Now we just have a way that you've ranked them and you've picked out certain parts of the contract to somehow to illuminate. I think it's important that the contracts are public. I think we shouldn't be afraid of that as unions, and I think we should engage in the kinds of discussions that are necessary. The report, I think it's kind of a typical way we do business. We really often focus on narrow things and maybe sometimes focus on the wrong things. I think critics do that. I think management does that. And I think sometimes we as unions focus on a narrow analysis. We focus on things such as, is there a cap on faculty meetings? If there's a cap on faculty meetings, according to this report, somehow you no longer have a flexible contract. Is there a stipend for professional development? If there is, somehow you have a less flexible contract. Again, whether something is stated in the collective bargaining agreement. Do we give leave for union business? You somehow have a less flexible contract. I think by doing that, what happens is we focus on these narrow items and we fail to focus on the kinds of things we should be looking at. And let me talk about compensation for a minute as well. I think that clearly we have to continue to have the dialogue about compensation systems and what kinds of systems are the systems that attract and retain the high quality of professionals. I'm not sure that narrowly focusing on the 4 elements or so that you focused on in the report really does that. I think it focuses on whether or not you have those 4 elements, and that's all it tells you. What I think we need to be engaged in here is a bigger analysis. And we need to start with looking at, between unions, management, school employees, to what extent do we know what the mission and vision of our schools are? To what extent do we have goals that really align with that mission and vision? To what extent do we align the collective bargaining agreement and the compensation system with that mission and vision? And start from the bigger picture rather than starting from a narrow analysis like the report does. Certainly the collective bargaining agreement is a central component to both teacher benefits and pay, but it's much more than that and can be much more than that. And sometimes we fail to realize that. And we all need to think about that. We shouldn't be hiding behind the collective bargaining agreement. We should be thinking about how we use it to really impact student achievement in a positive way. And we also have to look beyond the 4 corners of the contract. We have to look at culture. We have to look at practice. We have to look at resources. We can't ignore the collective bargaining agreement, but we have to look beyond that. We have to look, do we provide adequate funding? Do our children come to school prepared to learn? Do they have health care? Do the students who leave our schools have jobs when they leave our schools? I think those are also things that we want to focus on. And then finally, I would say, I wonder if the authors really believe the rhetoric that's in the report that says they want to professionalize teaching, when it looks to me like they're going back to a 1950s model, an authoritative, hierarchical model that is clearly not what is envisioned in the United Auto Workers or in the Saturn plant. Clearly a more participative process is what's envisioned. So it feels as though on one hand they're talking about professionalizing the profession, on the other hand they're talking about a hierarchical model that clearly isn't in the best interests of the school, nor in the best interests of the employees, nor in the best interests of the students. I do agree with so many things that were said before about relationships. about building a relationship between the union and the administration and the school board, and we need to focus on big issues and start with the big issues and get off of the small issues before we can even know where we want to head.
Thank you, Bill.